All right, everybody. New breaking news. Turkey has involved itself further in Syria, striking some of the Kurdish forces there within the country. Now, it's a complex situation because you have these two different sort of militant Kurdish arms. One of them, largely in Syria, is primarily fighting ISIS. They've actually done quite a good job in doing so. They hold some land there, although they're one of the more minor players as far as geographic extent. The other is a Turkish, I believe it's the PKK, within Turkey largely, that are sort of like revolutionaries, and they conduct various attacks in Turkey because they want Turkey to release what they see as their tribal land. They wish to fuse this with parts of northern Syria, some of these other marginal zones, to form their own sort of a cultural bloc. Now, the difficulty is this. The United States, NATO at large, and Turkey, as part of NATO and involved in the region, see the PKK as a terrorist organization, but the United States does not extend that to the specific Kurdish militants in northern Syria attempting to fight ISIS at the moment. I would say, unlike the FSA, which we armed and funded for so long, and they're terrorists, so-called moderate rebels, which means that instead of beheading every civilian, they only behead those who won't proclaim fealty to them. And I don't think we should arm or fund them at all. Unlike the FSA, the Kurdish militias in Syria actually are largely focused on fighting ISIS. So they're sort of like the Iranians or something within the region. That's their primary focus. Partially, I think, though, that's because ISIS has control of areas in proximity to them. Assad sort of got shoved to the coast, and really there was no opportunity for him to spar with these Kurdish groups. Not that he wouldn't purge them if he was able to actually go through these ISIS-controlled zones to do so. And we've got to understand, I think, as the United States or the West, NATO at large, we've got to understand if ISIS does end up getting forced out of Syria, and right now the whole country still looks like Swiss cheese as far as who controls what, the next step will be that Assad is going to attack those Kurdish forces, along with whatever remnant of the FSA happens to be within the region. I think the FSA at this point might be the weakest group in the region. Iran arguably has a greater influence in a direct sense, which isn't necessarily bad because they're allied with Assad. Preferable to ISIS, certainly. I say preferable to the FSA. I think idiots like John McCain who want to keep giving lethal aid to the FSA are just prolonging the civil war there. They're causing tens of thousands of deaths. It's the same old story where people judge things based on a symptom and they don't actually look at the central disease. The disease in that region is that we tried to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. That's the primary reason that a civil war started. It's the primary reason that there's a refugee crisis. It's the primary reason ISIS ended up in the region. It's the primary reason why these Kurdish groups rose up, and then by Washington sort of whining and dining them, it pisses off the Turks, driving them closer to Russia. The primary disease was U.S. interventionism within the region. I happen to oppose it. There are areas in the world where we've intervened and we've done good. Syria is not one of them. It's much like the tale of Libya or our attempt in Egypt, which thankfully got smoothed over. We should be counting our lucky stars that we didn't end up installing a permanent Islamo-fascist dictatorship in a nation like Egypt, with a military as large as theirs, with manpower as large as theirs, with control of the Suez Canal. It would have been terrible. It would have been utterly horrific if the Muslim Brotherhood had actually prevailed in Egypt. We should be very thankful that it didn't. We should also be thankful, whatever you think of Assad, he's butcherous, he is a dictator light, and he does things that are not great to do to other people within his own country. But what drove him to these last rounds of barrel bombs and so forth? What drove him to that? What took a nation that largely was stable, there wasn't a civil war at least going on, what drove him to those actions was Western intervention propping up the FSA, the Kurds rise up, ISIS fills in the area. The Iraqis get involved in this as well. Iran finally has to march in with Russia's blessing Now Russia and China, indeed, to a lesser extent, are both directly involved also. Now, we hear that one of our carrier groups in the region, I don't know whether this is verified or simply rumor at this time, has been given orders for extraordinary actions based on Turkish movements within the region. I wouldn't think that it's likely that the U.S. would attack Turkey's forces, considering, number one, as far as their control, the Bosphorus kind of necessary to at least stay somewhat tolerable in their book in order to move freely throughout this region. Number two, they are in NATO. It'd be kind of hard for two NATO allies to actually strike one another. That being said, I'm not sure that these Turkish maneuvers are going to be helpful, considering that this is the offshoot Kurdish group that's actually doing the best they can to fight ISIS primarily. See, Turkey and Assad, regardless of the bad blood between them, may end up with themselves fighting the same enemy at some point. As ISIS weakens, those Kurdish forces will expand. Assad's forces will also expand. That will draw them into proximity. What you could have is a two-nation war, where Kurdish separatists in Turkey conjoin, at least in a loose degree, to the Kurdish forces in northern Syria, and end up getting attacked by Turkey and Assad at the same time. Or you could have Erdogan pulling a fast one, stabbing Assad in the back and attacking him for his land, which they would claim, Erdogan would say, oh, a new Ottoman Empire now, and NATO's not going to do anything. We're in NATO, so the West can't do anything. We're kind of friendly with Russia, so they can't do anything. We'll get involved within the region. We'll strike a deal with Russia on trade. We'll prop up some other regime in the area that they happen to like. We'll make a guarantor that will install like Russian puppets in Iraq or something. And Turkey does technically have the military capability of doing this. I think the only counterbalance within the region is Egypt. That's the funny part. The other main military player, as far as its technology and manpower and some of its weapons of war that has any regional projective force and would be willing to get involved, would probably be Egypt. Now imagine if the Muslim Brotherhood were still in control there. Probably not. Trump, by virtue of being like the anti-Obama, may be able to make better inroads with both of these countries and try to keep things calm. And it's also unhelpful when we perturb Bashar al-Assad. It's not helping anybody. We shouldn't even be in the region. If we're going to be in the region at all, it should be actually dedicated towards trying to calm the scenario that's actually going on and just striking ISIS. If Assad and the Kurds expand and Turkey and Assad and Iran and all these countries get drawn into a regional conflict because ISIS is gone and now they're fighting one another, so be it. We can broker things down the road. We can't even do anything as long as ISIS is in operation. They're a non-state actor. The Kurdish forces here, technically speaking, on both sides of the Turkish border are non-state actors. It's very difficult, I think, for us to justify propping up one separatist group because it happens to be in Syria, when any gains that it makes, at least indirectly, empower the Kurds that are also attacking Turkey within their own borders since the 1980s. If you want to maintain them in NATO, it doesn't make sense to prop these groups up. I know a lot of people would say, yeah, but Turkey is under the control of their own tin horn. That's true. Turkey has now regressed away from being a westernized nation and is now little different from maybe Saudi Arabia or something, to the point where Erdogan doesn't even care about his country's educational system. That's all true, but at the same time, you do have a relatively large economy, a relatively powerful military that controls a major trading site. It would be, again, like Egypt. You have to be able to work with them to at least some degree. You don't need to make more enemies in this region. We've got enough of them as is. So when Turkey goes across the border and starts striking things, Assad might actually not care about that fact because his forces aren't the ones being shot at. This is a group he's going to end up confronting anyway as ISIS gets marginalized. But at the same time, then Turkey happens to be weakening the group that is primarily, at least in the northern part of the country, doing the weakening of ISIS to allow Assad to expand. Can you say a complicated situation? And then to have Iran marching around within the region and Russian jets and everything, U.S. carrier group, Chinese battle group. Everybody's in the region. It's like an assembly for World War III. By the way, I'm not expecting that'll happen, but could it explode into a large regional war? Yeah, you bet it could. Very, very easily. That would certainly fuck with the world markets. Janet Yellen comes out the other day, says, "Oh, I don't see another fiscal crisis looming in our lifetime." Bullcrap. A large war there would destabilize most of the world's economy. And of course, anytime all of these talking heads that represent the Fed or some other group, anytime they get optimistic, that's when a crash happens. So you should be fairly concerned, I think, about her statement there. That would probably make it more complicated in the Middle East, too, because all of these economies would suddenly find themselves in hot water. Some of these nations are oil reliant, other nations in there are commodity reliant. They would take a major hit. It'd be like Russia sliding into recession because their energy sector suffers because of the oil crash or something like that, or because U.S. fracking firms make up the difference and don't really care about the world prices because we can just prime the pump over and over again and flood the world markets with oil. It's getting worse in the Middle East, not getting better. And this all goes back to our original intervention in some of these regimes. Sometimes it dates back to the Eisenhower administration. A lot of people don't even know that. We're talking about Iran. We're talking about the 60s and 70s. We're talking about intervening in Iraq as early as the mid-atomic era. It's not just a modern thing. Things were for a while improving, but then we had all these strong-arm dictators. They started breaking loose from Western control, which they were originally under, as their economies grow. And then things get worse and worse, and now we've got jihadists running around because we had to stomp the Soviet Union, so we had to arm the Taliban, and then the money and weapons there start flooding out from Afghanistan. We've, in fact, made the world arguably a worse place. I think it would be easier to deal with the USSR at this point than to deal with some of these regimes. Because because you've got so many nations involved and so many non-state actors, it gets so complex. It's not like one monolithic enemy that's solidified simply against the Western world, and you have Warsaw nations and stuff, and the Iron Curtain. It's not like that anymore. It's not so simple. It's a lot less simple. The only rough equivalent to what's going on in the Middle East back then would have been maybe like when Pol Pot and the Vietnamese went to war, and then China and Russia sort of fractured on some of these issues and couldn't agree on who represented legit communism or something like that, and they had their own problems. You know, China invaded Vietnam. A lot of people don't realize that either. They've never heard of it. But, yeah, I'm sure that Erdogan right now is kind of happy. Assad's probably a little bit happy, but he must be kind of concerned as well, because now ISIS has fewer people potentially as the Kurds in the region, they get bombed by the Turks. Then there are fewer soldiers there to sort of suppress ISIS. And ISIS, remember, still has some U.S. weapons and so forth that they managed to grab in Iraq, that they've been moving around these areas. They still want their local caliph. I don't think at this point that they can get it, but they can certainly persist for a very long time. And as long as they're there, there will be a civil war, and there will be a refugee crisis, and all of these other problems. And you've always got the risk somebody gets a hold of some material and makes a dirty bomb and deploys that somewhere like Moscow or Paris or something like that. That would be just about the worst scenario you could imagine. That's about all. Peace out.